All right, good morning, church. This morning we'll be looking at chapter 49 of Genesis. And I know I say this a lot, but I really mean it this morning. This isn't going to take me very long to get through. Most of this, you can go ahead and laugh because I know I say that a lot. But Genesis 49 is basically, when you go through it, it's almost whenever he's giving his blessing and rebukes to his children. Jacob is giving blessing and rebukes to his children. It's almost a recounting or a summary of a lot of the things we've already seen in Genesis. So we'll move pretty quickly through it. There are two main things that I focus in a little bit on more, and that's Reuben, who was the firstborn, kind of getting his firstborn status revoked, and Judah, who was not the firstborn, actually getting half of that birthright, and Joseph getting the other half. But we see here Jacob is at the end of his life. The covenant family has been in Egypt for quite some time. The brothers have been reconciled. We know Joseph is alive. Jacob had seen him, had thought he was dead, and has now seen him and laid eyes on him. And now, before Jacob dies, finally, he's had a foot in the grave for like 40 years. We was talking about this before service. He's been saying, "I'm going to die," since before his children were born. And they've been in Egypt for over 30 years at this point. So it's been like 40 plus years. He's been going on about dying. Well, today it happens. He dies, finally. He gathers his sons around and he speaks over them blessings and rebukes. And that's really a lot of what we see in this chapter. The covenant family being blessed. Not all of them are blessed in the same way. Some get rebuked. Some receive blessings of fruitfulness. We see some old sins being brought back up, the reason for some of the rebukes. But in the center of it all, we see the great promise that the ruler will actually come from the line, or from the lineage of Judah. So we'll go ahead and read the passage this morning, reading from the ESV, chapter 49. We're going to read the whole chapter, 1 through 33. It says, "And Jacob called his sons and said, 'Gather yourselves together, that I may tell you what shall happen to you in the days to come. Assemble and listen, O sons of Jacob, listen to Israel your father. Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might and the firstfruits of my strength, preeminent in dignity and preeminent in power. Unstable as water, you shall not have preeminence, because you went up to your father's bed, and you defiled it. He went up to my couch. Simeon and Levi are brothers, weapons of violence are their swords. Let my soul come not into their counsel. O my glory, be not joined to their company. For in their anger they killed men, and in their willfulness they hamstrung oxen. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. Judah, your brothers shall praise you, and your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons shall bow down before you. Judah is a lion's cub. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He stooped down, he crouched as a lion and as a lioness, and who dares rouse him? The scepter shall not part from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. Binding his foal to the vine, and his donkey's colt to the choice vine. He has washed his garments in wine, and his vesture in the blood of grapes. His eyes are darker than wine, and his teeth whiter than milk. Zebulun shall dwell at the shore of the sea, and he shall become a haven for ships, and his border shall be at Sidon. Issachar is a strong donkey, crouching between the sheepfolds. He saw that a resting place was good, and the land was pleasant, so he bowed his shoulder to bear, and became a servant at forced labor. Dan shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. Dan shall be a serpent in the way, a viper by the path that bites the horse's heels, so that his rider falls backward. I wait for your salvation, O Lord. Raiders shall raid Gad, but he shall raid at their heels. Asher's food shall be rich, and he shall yield royal delicacies. Naphtali is a doe let loose that bears beautiful fawns. Joseph is a fruitful bough by a spring. His branches run over the wall. The archers bitterly attacked him, shot at him, and harassed him severely. Yet his bow remained unmoved. His arms were made agile by the hands of the mighty one of Jacob. From there is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. By the God of your father who will help you, by the Almighty who will bless you with blessings of heaven above, blessings of the deep that crouches beneath, and blessings of the breasts and of the womb. The blessings of your father are mighty beyond the blessings of my parents, up to the bounties of the everlasting hills. May they be on the head of Joseph and on the brow of him who was set apart from his brothers. Benjamin is a ravenous wolf, in the morning devouring the prey, and at evening dividing the spoil. All these are the 12 tribes of Israel. This is what their father said to them as he blessed them, blessing each with the blessing suitable to him. Then he commanded them and said to them, I am to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite, in the cave that is in the field at Machpelah, to the east of Mamre in the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought with the field from Ephron the Hittite to possess as a burying place. There they buried Abraham and Sarah his wife. There they buried Isaac and Rebekah his wife, and there I buried Leah. The field and the cave that is in it were bought from the Hittites. When Jacob finished commanding his sons, he drew up his feet into the bed and breathed his last and was gathered to his people. So he gone. Jacob finally gone. All right, like I said, a lot of this is almost a recounting of things that have happened and Jacob blessing and rebuking them based on who they've been and what they've done. But we see in verses 1 and 2, it says that Jacob called his sons and said, gather yourselves together that I may tell you what shall happen to you in the days to come. The phrase, the days to come, I think is important. We see Jacob looking ahead in faith. He's not just looking backward over his sons' lives, but he's actually looking forward. It's a form of covenant prophecy. Okay, God is showing where the promise is going. Like, yes, he is recounting the things that have happened up to this point in the story, but he's also showing where it's going in the future. Verse 2 says, assemble and listen, O sons of Jacob, listen to Israel, your father. We see here that both names are used. We've talked about that a few times in the past. They are sons of Jacob, but they are to listen to Israel, which is the name that God actually gives to Jacob. We know Jacob is the man who schemed and deceived and wrestled and all of those things. But here we see Israel, the covenant man that's renamed by God. He's about to die in Egypt in this passage, but he still dies believing in the promises of God for the future of his family, of the covenant family and the nation of Israel. Now once we get into verse 3, we start seeing what's happening with Reuben. If you remember all the way back in Genesis chapter 35, it was very briefly mentioned, and I covered it kind of extensively back then, even though it was briefly, and pointed forward to chapter 49, which is where we see the outworking of that sin. So when we come here, we need to kind of slow down. We see that it says that Reuben is his firstborn, his might, the first fruits of his strength, preeminent in dignity and preeminent in power. So Reuben was the firstborn. By all natural cultural expectations, Reuben should have been the person who had the place of leadership among all of his brothers. He should have had the preeminence. And basically what is meant by preeminence is that he resided over them. He was born first, and he is the one that is going to lead and reside over his brothers. He should have been the one who had the preeminence. And he should have been the one that was marked by dignity and power. Jacob even says that plainly. It's his firstborn, his might, the first fruits of his strength. But Reuben had this natural position by birth. He had the firstborn status. But when we get to verse 4, we see the language kind of shift. It says, unstable as water, you shall not have preeminence, because you went up to your father's bed, then you defiled it. He went up to my couch. So again, this takes us back to Genesis 35, particularly in verse 22, where Reuben went and laid with Bilhah, which was his father's concubine. So again, at the time, Moses very briefly mentions this thing, but I told you back then to keep it in mind because the outworking of what happens with that is now here in Genesis 49. So even though it's mentioned briefly there, we see that this hidden sin didn't just go away. It wasn't just passed over by God. You know, Jacob knew what happened. God knew what happened. And now we see here at the end of Jacob's life, all these years later, that sin is brought back up. And because of that, Reuben is losing his preeminence, his residing over his brothers, firstborn status, whatever you want to call it. I think that is something that's very important for us to see, because even though that sin is just briefly mentioned, it doesn't mean that it's a small thing, right? Reuben's sin wasn't just sexual immorality, but it was actually a sin against his father's house, right? We know the covenant household makeup. We've talked about it many times, so I'm not going to sit here and go through all that again, but it wasn't just sexual immorality. He was sinning against the covenant household of his father. He defiled his father's bed, and it's an attack on the order of the family. Now, at this time, the law hadn't been written, the Mosaic law didn't exist, but we see how seriously God takes this particular sin because he specifically forbids this kind of sin in Deuteronomy 22:30. It says, "A man shall not take his father's wife, so that he does not uncover his father's nakedness." So what Reuben did in Genesis 35 is later condemned very clearly in the law. I think that's applicable in many ways, but one of the things that we need to understand is that this wasn't just a private sin with private consequences. We've seen it glanced over briefly in 35, but now we see the outworking of such a heinous sin. The sin has cost him his firstborn status. He no longer is the one who is to be preeminent. He loses his preeminence of the firstborn. He has his leadership of the family completely stripped away. And that doesn't mean that God's covenant promise has failed or that Reuben is erased from Israel altogether, because he's not. As we continue through the Old Testament past Genesis, you see, that he has a clan that he is included in the covenant family still. But it does mean that Reuben is disqualified from the place that he might have had. I had an example. I ain't gonna go there. I ain't gonna go there. Yeah, I will, actually. So it's applicable in a sense today. I don't know how familiar anybody is with the preacher, pastor, evangelist, whatever. His name is Steve Lawson. I know Josh and Alton have him. Like, he's a graduate from the Master's Seminary. He spoke frequently in John MacArthur's church. He held his own Bible studies in Texas. He was actually pretty famous. A lot of men followed him. And in the last couple of years, it was found out that he had a secret affair. It doesn't go into detail exactly what it was, whether it was sexual in nature or emotional in nature. But nonetheless, it was an affair, extramarital affair. And in that time since then, he stepped down from his post. He's give up all his leadership and Bible studies and things like that. And we haven't heard much from him. I don't know that he's released a statement since his initial statement where he said he was stepping down and asking for forgiveness and that God would forgive him for that. So whenever we look at something like this with Reuben, I don't know what Steve Lawson's standing is before God. That's why I was going to not use this example. But it's very, very, very much so possible that Steve Lawson is a born-again Christian who sinned a terrible sin. And God has removed him from his post, but he still will be included in the people of God. When we get to heaven, I guess we'll find out if old Steve is there or not. But we see this kind of picture laid out in Genesis 49. Reuben sinned massively. He laid with his father's concubine. He disrupted the order. He brought chaos into the covenant household. And even though he's not erased from Israel, he is disqualified from the place he might have had. And I think Steve Lawson was a pretty good example of that. So anyway, I should have left that at that. But we live in a time where people think sin can be managed or hidden, softened, explained away, however you want to put it. But hidden sin has a way of coming back into the light. Reuben did this years and years ago, and now on Jacob's deathbed, the outworking of it is happening years later. So we know that God does forgive repentant sinners, obviously, or none of us would be here today. But forgiveness does not always mean that there is no earthly consequences. And I think that's the big thing that I'm trying to get at here. God does forgive all types and kinds of sin. It tells us that in the book of Exodus. But that doesn't mean that there are no earthly consequences for our sin. Reuben's sin cost him his preeminence. Steve Lawson's cost him his preeminence as a pastor and a leader in the church today. But all of this is kind of preparing us for Judah, because when Reuben loses that place, the leadership doesn't remain with him, and the royal line doesn't come from Reuben, but that preeminence he forfeited will be given elsewhere, and we'll see that here in just a few minutes. So in verses 5 through 7, we see Jacob turns to Simeon and Levi, and he says, Simeon and Levi are brothers, weapon of violence are their swords. This takes us back to Genesis 34. Like I said, all this stuff is really a recounting of things that have already happened. If you remember, Simeon and Levi went into Shechem and just ransacked the city and killed everyone. Do we remember that? Whenever they defiled his sister Dinah, Jacob was passive. He wasn't the leader of the covenant household the way that he should. So his sons, how was it you put it, Josh? If the fathers don't keep the order of the household, then sons with a lot less patience and a lot less restraint will deal with it. And that's what happened. And now we're looking back to that. What happened with Dinah was obviously wicked, and something should have been done by the father. There's no question about that. But Simeon and Levi answered wickedness with cruelty and vengeance. They wiped out an entire people group for what Shechem had done to their sister. I get it. I kind of get it. But it doesn't make it right, you know. The sinful side of me is like, all right, yeah, let's go. But no, we can't do that. They didn't act righteously. There was a way to go about this that could have been done righteously. But instead, they acted in wrath. And so in verse 6, Jacob says, let my soul come not into their counsel. So he doesn't want to be identified with their violence. He also doesn't want them to be the judge of what happens with him over his sin, the sins that he's had in his life. Basically, let my soul come not into their counsel. He knows that Simeon and Levi can be wrathful and vengeful men, and so he doesn't want his self to be judged by them. And then in verse 7, he doesn't necessarily curse them, but he says, cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. So he doesn't curse them as though they are cut out of Israel, but he curses their anger. And because of that, he says, I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. Later, we see this come to pass. Simeon is scattered and largely swallowed up within the tribe of Judah. Levi is also scattered, but with Levi, we see the grace of God intervene in a powerful way, because even though they're sort of scattered throughout Israel, they are in service to the Lord. That's where the priesthood comes from, is from the tribe of Levi. So in verses 8 through 12, now we come down to Judah. After we've seen now what has happened with Reuben, we come to Judah, and I think this is really the heart of the chapter here and why we read from Revelation 5, verses 1 through 5 to open service. We see in verse 8 that says, Judah, your brother shall praise you, and your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies, and your father's sons shall bow down before you. So now we see this major contrast with Reuben, who had his leadership role, his firstborn status, stripped away from him. Now we see the one who should have had preeminence does not have it. Reuben lost it. But Judah is the one whose brothers will praise him and bow before him. So Judah here is the one that's receiving the blessing. The language that's used here is of rule and of victory. And that's obviously not because Judah was sinless. I think we all remember Judah's past as well. He was the one who suggested actually to sell Joseph into slavery. I said slavery. Slavery. And he also sinned grievously regarding his sons and Tamar in Genesis 38. But if you remember, when up to that point in the story, every time we talked about Judah, we were really kind of hammering him because he was doing some pretty terrible things. He was not a very good leader. He was the one that wanted to sell Joseph. He had sinned with Tamar after not giving his sons to her. All this, but since then, if you've noticed as we've carried on through the chapters, we've seen a transformation, a major transformation of Judah from Genesis 38, the end of Genesis 38, whenever he calls Tamar more righteous than he. He recognizes his sin and repents of it. And since then, we've seen a change with Judah. We've seen him offer himself as a pledge for Benjamin. He stood before Joseph whenever they went into Egypt and, was going to take Benjamin's place. So Judah isn't chosen here because he is clean in and of himself. We've seen who Judah is and the issues that Judah has. But Judah is chosen graciously by God. And through Judah, God is going to bring the king that's going to save all of humanity. Verse 9 says, Judah is a lion's cub. Does anybody recognize that the terminology that's used here? That Judah is a lion's cub. What did we read in Revelation 5 that they refer to Jesus as? The Lion of the tribe of Judah, right? It's the first time that lion imagery is used in the Judah story. It says he is a lion's cub. So it's very common as you move through Scripture, this idea of the Lion of the tribe of Judah. So he's pictured here as strong. What do we call a lion? We call it what? The king of the jungle, even though they don't necessarily live in a jungle. They live in a savanna, but I digress. Anyway, we call him a king of the jungle. So we see here that Judah is being pictured as one who is a baby lion. He is a cub. He's one that's going to grow into a great king, and from him will come the greatest king of them all. So he's pictured as a strong and victorious leader who is dangerous to his enemies. He crouches like a lion, and Jacob asks, who dares rouse him? This is kingdom language. Judah is being marked out here as the royal tribe. And as we move through to verse 10, it says, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet until tribute comes to him, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. And this is one of the more clear messianic promises that we see in Genesis. The scepter is going to belong to Judah. The staff is going to belong to Judah. Kingship is going to come through Judah. It's being made very known here whenever Jacob is blessing his sons that the tribe of Judah is the line that the Messiah will eventually come from. So kingship comes from the tribe of Judah. We see that David and Solomon come from Judah. But it obviously doesn't stop there. It reaches forward to Christ, who is the true king from the tribe of Judah. So Genesis 49 isn't only about seeing Reuben lose his place as the leader, the firstborn, but it's actually telling us where it's going. So we're seeing a vision of faith here from Jacob. He's not only summarizing the sins of his sons as they move forward and blessing and rebuking them just based off of that, but he's actually looking ahead because he knows the promises that God has given to him and his fathers before him. And then we see in verses 11 and 12 the language of abundance. Judah binds his foal to the vine. He washes his garments in wine. His eyes are dark from wine and his teeth white from milk. And this is a picture of overflowing blessing. He has so much of these things that are considered a blessing to these people. And so the reign of Judah's king will not be a barren one. It will not be one that lacks anything. It will be a rule, a reign of abundance, of joy, of wine, milk, and blessing. And Christ brings that kingdom in abundance. He brings the wine of the new covenant and the feast of the new kingdom. And he brings joy and life he brings joy to the life that sin had stolen from mankind in the garden. So in verses 13 through 21, he moves through several of his sons a little more quickly. Zebulun, Issachar, Dan, Gad, Asher, and Naphtali all receive their blessing or rebuke that point forward to their future as tribes. One of the main things we should take from that, like I said, I'm not going to spend too much time on it, is that we see that God is appointing different places and different portions to his people. Not every tribe is going to receive the same blessing or rebuke. Not every tribe has the same future ahead of them in the kingdom that will come. Some will be near the sea, some will bear heavy burdens, some will be fighters, some will enjoy abundance. Huh? One will be in Kentucky. Zebulon. Yeah, there is a Zebulon, Kentucky. There is, indeed. But some will be known for beauty and fruitfulness. That must be the line that my wife came from. Brownie points. But I think that's important for us to recognize, though, that we see all these different things that they're being blessed or rebuked with, because that's the way that the people of God have always been. From then until now and forevermore until the new heavens and the new earth, God doesn't give every member of the covenant people the same calling. He doesn't give us all the same burden or the same place of service. But all of it is under the hand of the same covenant God. We're called to be here in Harts Creek to try to be a blessing to Lincoln County and Logan County, the surrounding counties of southern West Virginia. There are men who are trekking the jungles of the Amazon to bring the gospel to the people of those nations. They suffer infinitely more than what we do here in modern America. But nonetheless, as I said, God doesn't give every member of the covenant people the same calling, burden, or place of service. But all of it is under the hand of the covenant God. Then in verse 18, there's a quick little pause here, almost as if Jacob is saying a quick prayer. He says, I wait for your salvation, O Lord. And like I said, that feels almost like he's stopping and just giving a short prayer in the middle of his prophetic blessings of the tribes of the covenant household here. He's spoken of judgment, of violence, serpents, enemies, and all the future of all of his sons. And then he just pauses and says, I wait for your salvation, O Lord. And I think that is the cry of faith. Jacob has seen the sin and darkness that is in his family. He has seen the grief. He's seen the famine that was in the land, and he's seen the plenty that is now being harvested in Egypt. He's seen death of loved ones. He's seen the mercy of God in giving him back Joseph, who he thought was dead for so many years. And now at the end of his life, he's still waiting on the salvation of the Lord. So Jacob here is looking forward to the salvation of the Lord that is to come. He's looking forward into faith. We're not going to get into that a ton because Alton pretty well covered that 2 weeks ago. But all this right here and then the end of the chapter where he's being buried are very much so acts of faith looking forward to the coming Messiah. Verses 22 through 26, Jacob turns to Joseph, and we see that the words for Joseph are full of blessing. He's called a fruitful bough by a spring with branches running over the wall. There's some Christological stuff in that we can get into in Q&A if you want. But it's very fitting because Joseph, as we know, has been very fruitful throughout his life, even in terrible affliction. He was hated by his brothers, which was, I don't know, maybe a little bit his fault for gloating about ruling over them one day. He was hated by his brothers. He was sold into slavery. He was falsely accused in Potiphar's house. He was imprisoned, forgotten by the people who were supposed to speak on his behalf to the Pharaoh. But we know that God was with him. He was fruitful through prison, through Potiphar's house, in Pharaoh's court during times of famine. And verse 23 says, the archers bitterly attacked him, shot at him, and harassed him severely. I think that's the most accurate description of Joseph's life in this entire little section here. The archers bitterly attacked him, shot at him, and harassed him severely. So he's using a little bit of hyperbole about what exactly happened to describe Joseph's life, which we know he was, attacked by his brothers. He faced false accusations. We've seen, injustice. He was thrown into prison. But in verse 24, the verse immediately after that says, yet his bow remained unmoved, and his arms were made agile by the hands of the mighty one of Jacob. And that is the key. Jacob did not endure all of this because he was strong in and of himself. He endured because the mighty one of Jacob, who is spoke of here, upheld him in strength. And then we get these great titles. From there is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. We know that God, is the shepherd of Israel. God is the stone of Israel. He leads, feeds, protects, upholds his people. And as we read the rest of Scripture, we see this language kind of fulfilled in Christ, who is called the Good Shepherd, who comes and lays down his life for his sheep. And we know that Christ is the cornerstone that was rejected by men, but chosen and precious before God. So Joseph is the suffering son who becomes fruitful for the saving of many. Christ is the greater suffering son who is very much like Joseph, attacked, rejected, crucified, but upheld by God. And through this suffering, he becomes fruitful beyond measure, and his branches run over the wall to the nations. That's the Christological connection I was talking about. This also, though, helps us to understand what happened to that firstborn status. Reuben lost it, and now we see part of it had went to Judah, right? The birthright blessing, though, is associated with Joseph and his sons. So the firstborn privilege, the things that Reuben would have had himself, is now divided between Judah and Joseph. Judah receives the rule and preeminence that should have been Reuben's as the firstborn, while Joseph receives the double portion. Typically, the firstborn received a double portion. Their fathers blessed them doubly, and they were also the leaders and the rulers over their family. Now we see Judah receive that rule and preeminence, and Joseph receives the double portion. And all of it is governed by the wisdom of God. It's parsed out according to his will. And quickly, we'll finish out the rest of the chapter here. It says, verse 27, that Benjamin is a ravenous wolf, in the morning devouring the prey, and at evening dividing the spoil. So Benjamin is a pretty fierce guy. For him to be so desperately protected by his father earlier in this story, we see that he's described as someone who is strong and fierce. And actually later the tribe of Benjamin will be known for its warriors. Does anybody know what particular, one of the most well-known warriors who was actually a king of Israel came from the tribe of Benjamin? Trivia. He was a warrior king, came from the tribe of Benjamin. All right, I'll give you a hint. Y'all can't answer. It was the first king of Israel, Saul. Saul was a fierce warrior. We've seen him in the morning devouring the prey, and at evening dividing the spoil, even when God directed him not to, which cost him his position as king. But nonetheless, we see this blessing that's given to Benjamin and his tribe of being these strong and fierce people later in King Saul, who comes from Benjamin. Now, there's a New Testament apostle who was, and if anybody says Benny Hinn, you're getting kicked out. There's a New Testament apostle who actually come from the tribe of Benjamin as well, who was pretty fierce and vengeful up until a change happened. Does anybody know who it was? It was Saul of Tarsus. It was Paul. The apostle Paul came from the tribe of Benjamin as well. So we look at Benjamin here. He was the youngest and the beloved son who Jacob feared losing so terribly after Joseph was gone. He has a future among the people of God as well. And then, just real quickly here to start wrapping up, Jacob gives instructions about his burial. He tells them to bury him with his fathers in the cave of Machpelah, where Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob, Leah, they were all buried there. This matters. Like I said, Alton really dove into this a couple weeks ago, so I'm not going to sit and hammer this away. But it does matter that even though that Jacob dies in Egypt, his hope does not die in Egypt as well. It's very comparable to what happens with Moses. Moses dies before entering the Promised Land, right? We're kind of seeing the same type of thing, a preeminent version of that right here in this story. He dies in Egypt, but his hope is not Egypt. He wants to be carried to the place of his fathers. He has persevered here in Egypt. His son is a ruler in Egypt, only second to Pharaoh, but he knows that Egypt is not his inheritance. That's not what God has allotted for him and his people. He wants his bones to be left in the land of promise. So even in death here, Jacob is confessing faith in what God has promised. He's wanting to be carried away to the land that God has promised them. So we see in Hebrews 11, that those in the Old Testament, the fathers, they looked ahead at the promises that were to be fulfilled. And we are fortunate enough that we get to look back on the things that have already been fulfilled in most instances. But Jacob here is confessing his faith by looking ahead and knowing that God is going to be faithful to his promises even once he's dead and gone. He wants his bones carried there. And then in verse 33 says that when Jacob finished commanding his sons, he drew up his feet into the bed and breathed his last and was gathered to his people. So we see that Jacob's life here now is over. The deceiver who wrestled with God, who became Israel, the man who the entire nation comes from, the man who feared of losing everything and everyone his whole life. What did you call him before service, Josh? He was I can't think of it. Somebody who thinks they're sick or dying all the time. He's a hypochondriac. Jacob's been kind of a hypochondriac throughout this story. Always full of fear. He feared his brother after he stole his blessing from him. He feared all of his life the death of his family members. He's been talking about dying. But now, after all that fear and all the things that we've seen, he dies well. He dies in faith. He dies a man of faith, having not seen the promises that are to come. And I think that's a beautiful picture to the end of a life of a man who struggled desperately throughout his entire life with death and with famine and with hardship and with struggles and with deception and murder. His sons, wiped out an entire people group. The man has seen and suffered a lot, but he's seen and suffered well, and here he is finishing his race well. He's looking forward to the promise that God has given to him and his family. So as we wrap up here in Genesis 49, we see first that sin matters. Okay, Reuben's sin wasn't just forgotten and glossed over in chapter 35 and never mentioned again. We see that there are consequences for sin. So that's one thing to take away from today's passage. Even though sin may not count us out of the people of God, though it can, though that could end up in a big conversation I'm going to hold there. Sin obviously can affect the way that things are in our life. Simeon and Levi, they committed murder and violence against people. That wasn't ignored. And God is holy. Sin does not remain hidden forever, right? And so we should not treat lightly what God tells us that we should treat seriously. But we also see that God's grace is greater than the sin of his people. Reuben's sin, the things that happened with Judah in his past, the sufferings of Joseph and the things his brothers did to him, did not, despite their best effort, did not destroy the covenant that God had with his people. God preserved them because he is faithful, not because they are faithful or were perfect, but because God is faithful. One thing you can count on is when God makes a promise to his people, it will be kept. Though we don't always hold up our end of the bargain, we stumble, we fall into sin many times throughout our life. God preserves his people because he promised us that he would. Okay? And most importantly, we see now something that we're going to look at in probably pretty great depth in the book of Revelation. The king comes from the tribe of Judah. Reuben lost his preeminence. Judah receives this rule, the scepter, however you want to look at it. And from Judah comes Christ, who is called the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the one to whom the obedience of the nations belongs. So now we'll go ahead and have Josh and Alton come.